Day by day, Russia seems to be turning back the clock to darker times. Pick the worst periods of Russian history, and you will find echoes of them in the present day, whether they be the economic and mafia chaos of the 90s, the privations and exceptionalism of the Soviet period, nuclear threat of the Cold War era, or Stalin's repressions and purges. Even the slaughter of World War II, 19th century poverty, or unrelenting imperial expansionism of Ivan the Terrible's time. There are echoes of all of these in the events that are unfolding. In its political mythology and with its weaponized education system, Russia is a country whose focus is on the past more than the future. And daily it reminds us why looking forward can sometimes be far healthier than looking backwards. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce, and our material is now available on popular podcast platforms such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky is a prominent author, historian, and journalist, an expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union. He has appeared in print, TV, and radio interviews worldwide, and is widely known as the co-author of the book Blowing Up Russia with Alexander Litvinenko, a former lieutenant colonel in the FSB who was poisoned with radioactive polonium in London in 2006. His latest book, Blowing Up Ukraine, The Return of Russian Terror and the Threat of World War III, was researched before the invasion of Ukraine and is the first comprehensive investigation into the lethal methods Russia has used since 1999 to take over Ukraine, culminating in the full-blown unprovoked war in 2022 and the mounting atrocities from that. More recently, he has warned of the risk of a nuclear strike from the territory of Belarus, and it's this topic of strategic nuclear blackmail that we'll be discussing today. Yuri, welcome to the channel, and I'm delighted that you agreed to appear again. It is now the third time, so if people enjoy this, then they should definitely go back and check our previous two conversations as well.
Thank you.
Well, it comes on an extraordinary week. I think last time we spoke was shortly after the assassination of Daria Dugina, and here just yesterday we have Vladimir Tatarsky, I think his name is. And this really is a horrific echo of the 90s, isn't it? I mean, that's the period where I was studying Russian in St. Petersburg, and these kind of assassinations, explosions, mafia rivalry seemed to happen with some regularity, and it's got a horrible echo of those times, hasn't it?
Well, I have to say that Tatarsky actually is not his real name, and Vladlen, I do not know if you understand this or not. Probably you do understand that Vladlen is a name made out of Vladimir Lenin, Vlad Lenin, right? So he's not a very good person, to be honest. He was killed, and this was an act of individual terror. Several other people were wounded, but he was the only person who was killed. Many people are asking now the same question or questions, if this is done by the Russian government, if this is done by GRU, if this is done by the FSB. We do not have all information we need, not yet. My intuition tells me that we are dealing with individual terror in Russia, and the reason for this is the following. Starting 2000, Putin and the FSB with which he was working together basically destroyed any possibility for opposition, for any opposition. And by now, you do not really have political parties in Russia who are opposing Putin. You do not have organizations which are allowed to be in opposition to Putin. You are actually not able to walk outside your house with a sign "No War." And especially you're not allowed to do this if this is more than one person. My point is that the only form of opposition now, which is left, is individual terror. And I think that we are going to see it more and more often, both in Russia and in Ukraine, because all other forms of opposition are actually controlled by the FSB and destroyed by the FSB, mainly on preventive level. But when we deal with very small group of individuals, like 1, 2, 3 people, right, who decided that they're, they're obliged to oppose the war, and they look for the possible form of this opposition, to go outside and hold a slogan "No war" make no sense, because they simply will put you in prison anyway, and will beat you on the way. So they probably, some of those people probably are thinking that it's time to decide to do something more decisive, and that's why I think we will see more and more protests like this.
And in the manner it's carried out, in the organizational requirements, if we compare this to, say, the poisoning of the Skripals, if we compare this to the assassination of Nemtsov, those two acts would have required a significant amount of planning, which potentially couldn't have been done by one individual, but may have required many, many individuals. The poisoning of Navalny, I think, similarly would have required a team of people and deep preparation. Do you think this assassination this weekend is something that could have been planned by, one individual or just a small number of people with relatively little investment of time and resource?
Well, in those cases which you mentioned, we are dealing, of course, with government, right, which was behind the operations, right? Poisoning of Skripal, poisoning of Navalny, killing of Nemtsov. This is also important to understand, that no one actually was ever punished for those crimes, right? In case of Nemtsov, we probably do not have people, named, right? In case of Navalny, we know who was involved. In case of Skripal, we know who were involved, but it's not that they were arrested and prosecuted and sentenced for crimes committed. Here, of course, we have a woman who was arrested and was named by the FSB as the person responsible. Well, it demanded certain organization. I think this bomb should be prepared probably by somebody who knew how to do this. Again, the way it was organized, I would say, was very, professional, because again, this was not a dumb bomb which would explode and destroy everybody who's around. It was directed against one particular individual. You probably would have to know where that person would be a particular day and particular time. But since this was a kind of entertainment which he would provide to the crowd, it was known when and where he would be at a particular moment of his life. So, but again, I think we are dealing with a protest. This is protest against the war. The person who was killed, I mean, really, he was a terrible guy. What he was saying about Ukraine, what he was saying about Ukrainians, what he was saying about how they should be killed, etc., etc. I mean, this was not good at all. So it's not that we are going to miss him. We are not. And I think the punishment, was well deserved. But since we are talking about a war which is already taking place, for longer than 1 year. But my point is that this is happening because there is no other way for people to protest against the war. And if we want to look into history, what I try not to do very often, although I'm a historian. Russia was actually famous for its revolutionary terror in the beginning of 20th century, where sometimes, the entire cabinet of ministers would be executed by terrorists. And this was, by the way, a very important part of the struggle against the government. And if Putin's Russia would start to face this kind of level of individual terror, this might be very painful.
And of course, I mean, for those who haven't been to St. Petersburg, there's a magnificent cathedral on one of the embankments, isn't there? Which marks the spot, Spas na Kрови, which one of the Tsars, Alexander II, was assassinated in the
Right.
1880s. So yes, it's not unusual in Russian history for not just politicians, but also the people at the very top to be
Right,
targeted.
and Russian Prime Minister Peter Stolypin was actually killed by a terrorist in Kiev, by the way, in 1911. So now terrorists actually took down a lot of famous politicians in Russia.
And Mikhail Podolyak, who has some very colorful words often. He's described the situation as spiders in a jar eating each other. And of course, whenever a senior Ukrainian official comments, there is a lot of speculation that somehow Ukraine may have been involved. Do you think it improbable that there is Ukrainian involvement in this case?
I believe Ukrainians were not involved at all, and the FSB, by the way, the Russian government also named Navalny and his organization, and this is like a very peaceful, by the way, just foundation of Navalny, being behind this, and this I have to exclude as well. Ukrainians, it's not that Ukrainians are not capable to conduct active terrorism, individual terror. In Russia, they probably would be able to do to a certain degree if they wish to take somebody down, but they usually do it inside Ukraine on occupied territories. There are a lot of people who collaborate with the Russian occupational forces, and from time to time we hear that this or that government official who is a Russian government official working in Ukraine, or former Ukrainian officials who collaborate with Russians, they are killed. So this is happening in Ukraine, but this is happening in Ukraine, and it's much, of course, I would say, easier for Ukrainians to organize it within Ukrainian borders. Instead of sending somebody to St. Petersburg, which takes a lot of time and energy and much more complicated to arrange.
And of course, neither Ukrainians nor probably Russians care too much about the sort of administrators or collaborators who are being taken out by Ukraine. It's doesn't cause quite such a stir as these acts on Russian territory. And in this sort of segment, in this topic, I think sort of the last question I'm going to ask about this is about the monopoly of violence, because one thing that Putin was able to do, certainly in the first part of his reign, was to reestablish the state as having a monopoly over violence. But do you think that has been ceded, or has that happened already a long time ago with Kadyrov and Prigozhin and others?
Well, what we should expect, of course, that the longer this war continues, you have more people who are trained to kill, you see, and they sooner or later they will start to go back to peaceful life. But we had this phenomena after Soviet-Afghan war, when Soviet soldiers were coming back from Afghanistan, and they actually were mainly responsible for major organized crime groups in Russia, right? Because they knew how to use weapons, and they tried to how to say it, to earn money through this, right? And that's what we should expect as a result of Russian-Ukrainian war, only probably on a much greater level, because you have more people serving in Ukraine, and it became more, I have to say, cynical, than the Soviet-Afghan war actually was a war between two military groups, and there were certain rules, and the Soviet soldiers, they were there under comparatively strict Soviet discipline. What's happening in Ukraine when Prigozhin is recruiting criminals from Russian prisons, when they come back, and we already have these cases when they come back from Ukraine and they start to kill in Russia again, because, well, they're still criminals. So that's what will backfire, but Russia will feel it much later, of course.
Well, let's turn then to the topic that we mentioned in the intro, and that is unpacking the nuclear issue. But I think we also have to set some scenes here. And I know you know this is an area you've talked about a lot. You talked about it and predicted it, I think, way back in our first conversation. And I hoped and believed that what you were saying was too shocking and not going to happen. But things do seem to be unfolding in the way that you predicted, with Putin's announcement that he will potentially shift part of the nuclear arsenal onto the territory of Belarus. But if we take a step back, does that imply that Belarus is making this decision independently as a partner of Russia, or is it already fully a puppet or vassal state of Putin?
Well, I think there is no doubt at this point that Lukashenko has no role in making any major decisions. And we have to say that it's all started in March of 22. Actually, it started a little bit longer than a year ago, when Lukashenko withdrew Belarus from Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1995. And that's when Putin started to prepare this operation. So this is not a sudden decision. This is something which he was preparing to do for the entire year. Now, what's important to understand that the only reason Putin left Belarus independent is to have it an independent state. So he would fire nuclear weapons from independent state of Belarus. So retaliation would be against Belarus and not against the Russian Federation. As always with Putin, we try to figure out if he is bluffing or not, if he is blackmailing or this is for real. And I have to tell you that we had the same dilemma in February of 22, prior to his invasion of Ukraine, and some people were thinking and hoping that this is just a bluff, that he's trying to force Ukraine to do this or that, but he would never invade. I was belonging to a minority, I have to say, who were claiming that Putin would invade. And indeed, the book Blowing Up Ukraine, actually, the first edition of it was published in Russian and Ukrainian in Ukraine in 2015. So if we were talking now about bluff or blackmail, then Putin would transfer these nuclear weapons to Kaliningrad region, because for blackmailing or to frighten Europe, it would be much better to position it there. Kaliningrad region is actually deep inside Western Europe, and from there it would be very easy for this kind of tactical nuclear weapons, which he is planning to move to Belarus, to get to any country, including Portugal and Norway and Poland and Lithuania. But instead, he is moving it to Belarus. And now Lukashenko already stated several times that the main enemy of Belarus somehow are Poland and Lithuania. And unfortunately, that's what we should expect. So my problem is that if there are any red lines, and recently after war started against Ukraine, we mentioned them very often. What would be the red line which should not be crossed? The statement about positioning nuclear weapons in Belarus is this red line which is already crossed. We should not wait for that moment when weapons are delivered to Belarus, because from that moment it would be a matter of hours before a nuclear strike could be launched. And we know from Lukashenko, it's not that we are predicting or trying to imagine things. We know that from Lukashenko that Belarusian planes were sent to Moscow some time ago to be modernized, so they would be able to fire missiles with nuclear heads, because not any plane could fire those missiles. Putin mentioned 1st of July as a very strange date. He mentioned 1st of July as a day by which they should prepare kind of holding places for nuclear weapons. What is slightly puzzling, because you do not really need anything special for those nuclear weapons, because this is standard equipment for Iskanders, which do not need any special, housing, and the same may be said about missiles for Belarusian planes. So my point is that we probably should ignore 1st of July and think that we could sleep quietly until 1st of July and nothing would happen. And my point is, again, that the transfer itself might be done very quickly. And if this happens, this might be too late to react.
And if we park the absolute sort of horror and incredulity for a moment, what tactically or strategically does Putin think this move would have? Does he want a direct confrontation with NATO, or does he think this would shock the world into giving him concessions and coming to the peace talks? What's the outcome he would anticipate from such a move?
But here's the point, precisely. If he would want to have open confrontation with NATO, he would already have it. He does not want to have it. And his idea is that if the strike is made out of Belarus, then of course retaliation would be against Belarus, not against the Russian Federation. And he's correct thinking this. I'm sure that that's precisely how this would happen. In addition, I have to say that Belarus is comparatively small state. It positioned deeply inside Europe, and the retaliation probably would not be a nuclear retaliation, because in Europe we have responsible politicians and military leaders, and they probably would be not willing to risk a radiation going outside borders of Belarus. So the retaliation probably would be conventional. It's actually criminal for Lukashenko to agree to this plan, because he has to understand that if Belarus would strike against Poland or Lithuania or both, then Belarus might be really destroyed entirely by a conventional retaliation of NATO. And somehow he is okay with this. And I'm slightly puzzled by the absence of any reaction from Belarus, because again, everybody there, like state TV, state channels of Belarusian TV, they discuss with smiles how they will destroy Poland and Lithuania with nuclear strikes. That's fine, but no one is asking the question, well, aren't they going to retaliate? Is NATO going to retaliate? And no one is worried somehow about retaliation. What I think is very much irresponsible, unresponsible.
And of
And
course, a lot of the propagandists, I mean, already a lot of the original propagandists fled, didn't they, during the uprising against Lukashenko? So Moscow had to reimpose a kind of propagandistic order, and people were shipped in from Moscow, I believe.
right, precisely. But my point is that it's understandable that Putin doesn't care about Belarus and Putin doesn't care about Belarusian people. We could agree that Lukashenko has no power and no voice at all in discussing those things. But, there are other politicians under Lukashenko, there are military leaders under Lukashenko. There are normal people who are living there under Lukashenko, and it doesn't. It's even if they are not opposing Lukashenko, they still should think about possible retaliation in case Belarus would attack Lithuania and Poland. But Putin's idea, believe it or not, is very primitive. He thinks that if Poland and Lithuania are attacked with nuclear weapons, this would prevent military assistance to Ukraine, because it would not be possible to ship weapons to Ukraine through Poland, because mainly now it goes through Poland, of course. If you take Poland out of this picture, then the only way to assist Ukraine would be through Romania and Moldova, and this is much more complicated. I guess my point is that there are some cases in history when political leaders are so blind with the absolutely crazy idea of destroying an opponent. And in case of Hitler, for example, this were, of course, Jews who he was trying to kill, to eliminate. Then in the end, it damages them. So in case of Jews and Hitler, he actually spent so much, resources of German Reich dealing with Jews, that this led actually to weakening his military abilities. That's what Putin is doing now with Ukraine, and because of war in Ukraine, he's so much into this idea of taking control of Ukraine that he basically doesn't understand that if he isolates Russia entirely from Europe, and that's precisely what's going to happen if Belarus would be involved in nuclear strike against Poland and Lithuania, right? So then Belarus, of course, would be entirely destroyed, and Russia would be entirely isolated from Europe for the next, I don't know, 100 years, 200 years. And then the only partner and friend and neighbor with whom Russia would talk might be only China. And then the Russian state during the next decades would be taken by China, because China is much bigger, much stronger. And as everybody knows, the Asian part of the Russian Federation is like a desert. It's completely, it's empty. People do not really live there. So he's betraying, Putin is betraying Russia the way Lukashenko is betraying Belarus. And again, this is all done in order to prevent Western assistance to Ukraine, because Putin thinks that the reason he is not winning in Ukraine is because NATO is helping Ukraine. Well, NATO, of course, is helping Ukraine, but by the way, it is not obvious that without this help, Putin would be able to take Ukraine. This is not obvious, because he was planning to do this in February when he started the war, and he was planning to take Ukraine in a matter of a couple of weeks or 1 month. And during that time, there were no assistance from NATO. The assistance started to come indeed much later, and Putin still could not do anything with Ukraine, and he still couldn't take Ukraine. So this dream that or accusations that he's not able to win the war against Ukraine because NATO is helping Ukraine, and because Russia, as they now say in Russia, publicly and officially, that Russia is not fighting against Ukraine, Russia is fighting against NATO. This idea by itself is completely crazy. But again, they are not controlling the situation anymore. They basically do not really know what to do. The text which Medvedev, is the former president of Russia, by the way, is delivering to public are absolutely ridiculous and crazy. The latest interview of Patrushev, published by Russian press, is unbelievable collection of nonsense. The latest national doctrine for foreign policy, which they just published, like 42 pages document, it's unbelievably primitive and stupid, and there is not a single word of truth there. So they really are not understanding the situation at all, and they really do not know what to do anymore. So this idea of transferring nuclear weapons to Belarus and firing from Belarus, for them might sound as a very reasonable way to correct the situation.
And that's you've anticipated really one of my questions there, which is, watching recent footage of the Gorbachev era when he passed away, even watching footage from the sort of 70s, despite it being the height of the Cold War, it just strikes you that that was a more rational age in some respects. So it strikes me that the Russia has undergone in the last couple of years an actual civilizational decline, to the point where, as you say, absolute fantastical nonsense can appear sensible. Does that also perhaps track the fact that Putin not only is getting physically frail, could he also have, been cognitively weakened by the illnesses? Because he doesn't seem the sort of quick-witted, quite sophisticated verbally sort of politician that he was previously. And of course, he's no longer appearing at Valdayn and in public forums. We no longer see exactly what sort of mental state he's in.
Well, he is probably not in a good shape at all. But the problem is, unfortunately, that I still do not see him as a dictator. My point is that if you take Lukashenko down, the entire regime will collapse. if you take Putin down, this will not necessarily happen, because again, when we see around him people like Patrushev, who are basically saying the same, basically, right? We understand that it's not that there is a hope for any opposition, even within the FSB, for example, because some people still hope that, well, there are forces within the FSB who would understand that what Putin is doing is suicidal for the entire regime and for the organization as well. And I do think that this is suicidal. But at the same time, I do not really believe that there are forces there who would be able not to understand this, they probably understand this, but who would be able to collect enough power to deal with it. And I have to say, and this sounds, I don't understand that this sounds probably a little bit naive, because unfortunately in history, sometimes worse things are happening and good things which I expected to be done are not done. But I think that in case of Belarus, this is a time for NATO to intervene. Otherwise, we are risking to have nuclear strikes. I mean, real nuclear strikes against Lithuania or Poland or both. And in case of Belarus, we have Lukashenko, who lost elections in 2020. There was a government in exile formed this time under Tikhanovskaya, who was actually declared by opposition and by society as person who won elections. We have a lot of young Belarusians, of course, who left Belarus after 2020. We have actually military unit which from Belarus, which fights in Ukraine today against Russian forces. It's a Kalinovsky military group. I'm afraid that we have no time, and I'm talking as a historian now, not as a person who doesn't like FSB or Putin, or who would like to stop the war. This is also true, but I'm talking as a historian. I believe there is no way for NATO but to intervene, and this might be done by NATO as NATO. This might be done by Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and those Belarusians which are already in Ukraine fighting once again against Russians. And Poland and Lithuania, they do understand that this is very dangerous what's happening. It might be not seen this way in France or in Germany, but in Poland, they do understand that this danger is real. In Lithuania, they do understand that this danger is real, that their countries might be destroyed by a nuclear strike of irresponsible politician who is not a really politician anymore, Lukashenko. So I believe that we are risking much less if we try to prevent the strike. And to prevent the strike, we need to intervene into Belarus and try to take down Lukashenko and try to change his regime. And I do not actually see any great difference between Americans trying from time to time to change regime and some, distant countries. Sometime very much successfully, sometime without great success, but nevertheless with certain level of success. And I think it's time to do the same in Belarus. Otherwise, otherwise we are risking to have nuclear confrontation in Europe. So that's what I would do if this would depend on me. And basically, I would again try to deal with this problem preventively. I do not think, by the way, that from military point of view, the the invasion into Belarus might be a difficult operation. I do not think so. It's very questionable if Belarusians would defend Lukashenko. It's very questionable. I am talking about Belarusian army. It's very questionable if they would support Russian troops. There are Russian troops there, but as we know now, Russian troops are not really doing great, and they were concentrated recently in Belarus in order to try to take Kiev for the second time. And it seems to be that they're not ready to do this because this, planned operation never happened. So I do not really believe that you are going to have major military confrontation because of this attempt to change a regime in Belarus, but this definitely would guarantee us that we will avoid nuclear catastrophe.
I mean, there's all sorts of unforeseen consequences, aren't there? And the last year has taught us that Putin, who was a great opportunist, and extremely lucky in many of the adventures he embarked upon, in the Crimea and so on. He actually came away victorious in many of them. But the last year has shown that, to an extent, his judgment and luck has run out. He said that NATO was a threat, and yet he's managed to double the borders of NATO. He said that Western Europe, militarily was a huge threat to Russia, when in fact its military had been run down to a near inoperable level, as many of the sort of military experts I've spoken to have talked about. And of course, now you're seeing Europe rapidly rearming. You're seeing Ukraine and Poland potentially going to be the largest conventional powers in Europe. And of course, Putin talked about demilitarizing Ukraine, and yet has managed to donate thousands of vehicles and pieces of ammunition to the Ukrainian army. The biggest benefactor to Ukraine's military force is actually the equipment that Russia abandoned. So he seems to have sort of lost his power of judgment, and every action he takes seems to turn into the opposite of what he intended. Could it be the same in Belarus? Could you see the Belarus army perhaps revolting to prevent nuclear weapons being placed on their territory? Or could you see Ukraine perhaps working with the Belarus military to do that coup that you talk about there? Because I fear that the US is still reluctant to get involved. They're still perhaps not supplying Ukraine to win, but merely to survive still. I don't know what your sense of the sort of Pandora's box that could be unleashed by Putin's inept strategies.
Well, of course, the main problem NATO has with Putin in this framework of the Russian-Ukrainian war is that they're afraid very much to provoke Putin and create a nuclear conflict out of this conventional conflict. And that's why NATO is helping Ukraine, very slowly, and still until today conducting this war as a defensive war. So Ukraine is basically, you are right, given weapons which helps them to defend themselves, but NATO still does not give Ukraine offensive weapons, without which Ukraine is not able to win the war, because from military point of view, if you're waging the war as a defensive war, you're not able to win it. And for example, with the weapons which Ukraine is receiving from their Western partners, they are not allowed to strike against Russian territory or Belarusian territory. So this leads to a ridiculous situation when Ukrainians are doing quite well when they're fighting against Russians, but they're not able to win this war, because they even are not able to push Russians from occupied territories, right? Because Russia is regrouping in Belarus and in Russia, and then sending their troops again back to Ukraine. So again, this is slowly changing. I have to say, Ukraine is getting more weapons and better weapons, but the problem now is time. And I'm afraid that we do not have a luxury of conducting this war for another year. In other words, if we would know that this year would continue the way it was continued during the entire previous 12 months period, we would say that, well, sorry for the Ukraine, but at least this is not spreading further. This is staying within Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian borders. I do not think that's what we are going to have for a very long time, mainly because this delivery of nuclear weapons to Belarus. And I tell you what Putin would do. He's now saying, of course, that these are Russians who are controlling these nuclear weapons. Now, he's saying this because if he says otherwise, if he's just giving these nuclear weapons to Belarusians, then he would be breaking his signature on 1995 non-proliferation treaty. This also might mean that in the future he could transfer nuclear weapons, who knows, to Iran, for example. But this might be in the future. So he's saying that, well, we are just positioning nuclear weapons in Belarus, but we are going to be in control. I will tell you what's going to happen next. At one particular day, he would inform the world that Ukrainians sabotaged or took control of nuclear weapons and fired from those nuclear weapons, pretending that they are Russians, to provoke a conflict between Russia and NATO. So they would never accept the blame for the strike. That's what's going to happen next. So again, I would say that this is extremely dangerous to allow Putin to move nuclear weapons to Belarus. I do not know if there are any negotiations or discussions now are happening behind the scene. Probably yes. But unfortunately, I'm afraid that this plan was discussed with China as well. I do not think that the fact that Lukashenko flew to Peking some time ago had nothing to do with this, and I do not think that visit of Xi to Moscow recently again had nothing to do with this discussion. At least Putin basically announced about transfer to nuclear weapons to Belarus very soon after Xi left, and they mentioned something about next 100 years of unbelievable history, which both countries, should wait for. So I think this plan was discussed. I think this is done with the approval and permission of Chinese government. And again, China is, I'm sure, interested in having weak Russia, and that's precisely what Putin is delivering to China. And so this might have some, consequences for, as I mentioned, for Russia as well. But mainly at this point, I think we should concentrate on risks which this particular step of Putin would create for Eastern Europe.
I mean, it seems extraordinary to me that she would go along with this. Earlier in the year, both the Indian premier and Xi seemed to give Putin a bit of a dressing down in public and seemed to set some kind of red lines around nuclear conflict. I guess the scenario you've painted of a kind of false flag type operation, maybe they would acquiesce to that. Is China here really thinking, would it think of taking that Russian territory, wait until Russia is potentially weak, fragile, or even fragmented and falling apart, and then physically taking it? Or would they not have to do that? Would they simply have to take over the Russian economy and do it sort of in a sort of more of a soft power move?
Precisely. My understanding is that China, at least until now, I do not know what might happen in the future, never used army to achieve foreign policy goals. Unlike Russia, which always would use army if they need to achieve certain foreign policy objectives. So China is different, and I do not really expect China to invade with Russia and to take Siberia. But there are other tools for China to do this, and mainly economic tools and financial tools. And again, Russia is very weak now, as we know. A war with Ukraine, a war with Europe, a war with NATO doesn't make Russia stronger at all, and there is no way this would lead to a stronger Russia. This is an irony, because you're correct. What Putin is doing, his initial objectives, of course, are very much different from what he's getting as a result. And the result is that Russia is becoming weaker and weaker and weaker every day, and Russia is more and more and more isolated every day. And this puts Russia in extremely difficult position, when I'm afraid it's true, the only friend or partner which Russia could have now, the main one, of course, is China. There is also North Korea, there is also Iran, and that's it. This is basically all they might afford now. And the level of, damaged which Putin done to relations which Russia had with Europe is so much that Russia probably is going to be isolated from Europe for a very, very, very long time. And, borders are still open. The amount of Russians who left Russia since February of 22 is extremely high. You feel it when you go, through the streets of European cities. You see them in Poland, you see them in Lithuania, you see them in Germany, you see them everywhere. And these are Russians which were not there like a year ago. And this is a completely new phenomena. And trust me, when we talk about immigration like this is, how to say, the best level of Russians. These are people who are more educated. These are people who, manage to earn some money, so they are able to emigrate. And those people are lost for Russia forever. So again, the damage which is done by Putin is extraordinary. And the same probably now relates to Belarus, and I'm waiting with certain interest, also in the interest is the wrong word probably now, but as a historian, whether some forces will rise in Belarus and will try to take Lukashenko down, because what he's doing is suicidal for Belarus as a nation. And it's surreal. what's happening now is surreal.
And of course, I mean, Putin probably has partially some awareness of the damage he's doing, despite the fact he's on this suicidal trajectory. He must realize that he has weakened the Russian military, the state, the finances, even though he doesn't care about these things. He must have some awareness of this going on. So he knows that this is not working. We know it's not working. We know it's absolutely insane. And of course, there was a recording made available last week between Iosif Prigozhin and Farhad Ahmedov. One a music producer, and the other one a former billionaire. And this fascinating half-hour conversation was recorded. Lots of sort of expletives in there. They also describe Putin, I think, as toxic, and a toxic dwarf, I think, is one of the phrases from that. But these are two people in public who support the regime, who support the military operation. Behind the scenes, they are openly saying that Putin has destroyed the country, destroyed the economy, destroyed, of course, their personal pleasures, their ability to access their yachts and their villas and all this kind of stuff. So it's, they're not necessarily moaning on behalf of the Russian people. They probably don't care either. But there is clearly then in the ruling class this consciousness that this is disastrous war and disastrous trajectory they're on. And yet, no one is trying to take over the helm.
Well, but here's the problem. They're rich, this is true, but they're not part of the ruling class. That's the problem. The problem is that the only ruling class in Russia now is Putin and the FSB. And this is the only institution which rules the country. And there are no other groups, no other organizations, nothing else. This is the problem. So those people, and this was, I was listening to this in Russian, and the language which they were using was very, how to say, unusual. You do not usually use those words, let's put it this way. You usually do not use words which they used when they were describing the situation, and Putin as well. But the problem is that they understand that there is nothing what they can do. And it's true. And it's true. We think that those rich Russians who are either living abroad or in Russia, that they have influence over Putin. They do not. He has influence still because he could take all of their money. He could, take it little by little, what he probably does. But they do not they do not have any influence. And Putin, I'm not sure that he actually understands that this battle is lost. I think he's in denial. I think Patrushev is in denial. I think Medvedev is in denial. I think Lavrov is in denial. They really do not understand. They do not understand what went wrong. And I would tell actually what went wrong. What went wrong is that Zelensky refused to capitulate in day number one. That's what went wrong, because the whole idea was that the entire world, not just Zelensky, that everybody would capitulate, because everybody would be afraid of war or nuclear war, or Russia using nuclear weapons, or Russia turning off a pipeline with gas to Germany. They basically were not planning to have a war. They were planning to accept capitulation from one country after another country. And this brilliant quote-unquote plan was ruined by Zelensky and Ukrainian people who decided basically that there is no way they're going to surrender to Russia. And then you have country after country, like Poland first, Lithuania second, etc., who were under Russian occupation, who knew quite well what does it mean to be under Russian occupation again, and who basically said to everybody, including partners in NATO, that never again. that it's never again that they would allow Russia to control Eastern Europe. And I think that's how it's all started. So, after 1 year, this war, I would say, moved through 3 stages, and while we might be now at the 4th stage, the nuclear stage, and this probably is the last one, when in the beginning, everybody wanted to stop this war and was ready to stop this war through Ukrainian capitulation. This did not happen. And then you had people like Macron trying to end this war through partial capitulation and partial surrender of territories to Putin. And this, of course, did not work well. It did not work because Ukrainians didn't want to surrender their territories, but it also did not work because Putin wanted the entire Ukraine. So then we came to the 3rd phase, and the day when this phase started was when France and Germany and Americans finally decided to supply tanks to Ukrainian army. Again, tanks probably are not there yet, but the moment when the entire NATO structure realized that the only way to stop this war, because again, everybody wants to stop this war, this is true, that the only way to stop this war is through defeat of Russian Federation. I think this moment happened when, France and Germany and Americans gave permission to supply tanks. And now I'm afraid we are at the 4th level of this war, when we have to deal with this extremely risky situation of moving Russian nuclear weapons to Belarus, and I think this is the last stage of this war, and I think if we do what we have to do, what's correct thing to do, we could end this war very quickly as well. Not only we would liberate from the Belarus, what is important because of strategic territory which Belarus, has, right? Because it allows Russia to have borders with Eastern Europe, and it allows Russia to use this territory for new advances against Ukraine and for possible advances against Eastern Europe. So not only we return Belarus to the family of European states, but we also actually win the war against this, Ukrainian war against Russian occupation, because from military point of view, it doesn't make any sense to wage this war the way it's done through from the east of Russia and from the south of Russia deep into Ukraine, because Russia was not able to take Donbass for 8 years. The war, for Donbass started in 2014 and never ended. We have now fighting against Ukrainian and Russian troops on the south and on the east, which is very similar to, First War battles which Germans conducted against French army and French against Germans. Basically, it's a positional war where you could not actually gain any victories. And to have this war without ability for Putin to strike against Kyiv, again, make no sense. So if we take Belarus from Putin, then we are winning the war. And this is the quickest way to do it, the easiest way to do it. And this might be done with much less blood than any other options.
And yes, maybe Kaliningrad needs to be reabsorbed as well and take that last little sort of defensive chunk out of Europe as well.
Well, that's actually what I usually tell when people discuss the borders of the new Russia. And I think that No one is going to take any territories from Russia. No one needs it. This was never done. Indeed, Russia actually, over the years of history, took pieces of territories from any of its neighbors, right? There is not a single one who did not lose territory to Russia, but the status of Kaliningrad probably should be, reconsidered, because you are not. You shouldn't allow to have Russia to have this, island inside Europe, from which Russia, from time to time, would try to fire into your territory. So, but I'm sure this will be discussed, and this issue might be approached. But first, we need to stop this war. But again, to stop this war means to win this war, and to stop this war means to take back Belarus, so Russia would not have ability to use this strategically important territory for further aggressive advances.
Absolutely, the last question, because we've been incredibly generous with your time, and this is harking back to what you mentioned about the FSB. I mean, in one of our previous conversations, we talked about really, to an extent, how strong collectively the FSB and the GRU has been, certainly in the Soviet period and later. But you are now sort of hinting that they don't have any influence over events, and collectively, is the sort of FSB quite a weak sort of class or organization at this point?
Well, it's when it started in 2000. I'm sure that Putin was just just a simple lieutenant colonel of the FSB who was chosen to be the next president of Russia. And the FSB, again, the state security exists in Soviet Russia since December of 1917. Today, this is actually the oldest organization which exists in Russia. It's more than 100 years old. It's a very powerful organization. We still do not really know how powerful this is, because we really do not even know how many people work for this organization. We might be talking about hundreds of thousands of people. This organization has a certain politburo, like in the old Soviet days. It's called Collegium of the FSB. In the old days, it was Collegium of the KGB, etc. This is like a Politburo, and recently Putin was reporting to it. It's giving reports to this structure from time to time. So this is an official structure. I do not really know, and this is the question, how powerful it is now. I'm quite sure that this was a structure which was choosing Putin as president, for example. But are they able to take him down today? I really do not know, because after 20 years in power, Putin probably became more powerful. In addition to this, in Russia, usually when you rule for 20 plus years, if you die, like this happened with Stalin or with Brezhnev, the entire structure collapses. And this is a danger for the FSB as well as the institution. So they probably would like to see Putin go, but they really are not sure that the entire structure would survive his absence, and probably not. So at one point, he is not a dictator, but at the same time, his death or whatever, retirement, could bring the collapse of the entire system. And it would be good for Ukrainians, for Europe, for everybody else. But for the FSB as an institution, this may not be good at all, because who knows what those people who would replace Putin, who knows what they would decide to do with the FSB, because the structure, it was dangerous since 1917. It was dangerous over this entire Soviet history, but it became extremely dangerous after 1991 and especially after 2000, when they started to rule the country without any political control. Because prior to 91, they existed under the political control of the Communist Party. So it was not an ideal situation, but at least there was a kind of political control. Now they do not have this control. Now, for the first time in history, really, for the first time in history, we have a situation when the FSB, the state security, is running the country. And not just the country, they're also running the army, they're also running, the nuclear arsenal of this country. That's why it became extremely dangerous. And we see now that they are losing control, that they are in complete denial of understanding that what they're doing is not just wrong, but very practical, that they're damaging themselves, they're damaging the country, they are ruining everything on the way, and they're not able to stop. They're not able to stop, they're not able to turn back, they're not able to reconsider policies, they're not able to accept mistakes. That's why I think they themselves force themselves into a corner from which there is no exit.
Well, Yuri, you've painted a terrifying scenario, one which we potentially have the power to avert in the way that you've described. I think this discussion is going to generate a lot of commentary, which is good. It's the idea. We want people to sort of think about this and think about how we can carry on supporting Ukraine. But I'm incredibly grateful to you for spending so much time to unpack the issues. I know, as we were talking about earlier, you've done many, many interviews already today, and it must be exhausting. But I think your insights are hugely appreciated by the audience and, of course, by myself as well. So thank you so much for appearing again.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to talk to you anytime,